Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peggy Mason, and I have the privilege to welcome you all to the third in our February 2021 six-session webinar program on Arctic security, and to briefly introduce our three co-sponsors before turning things over to today's moderator, Dr. Whitney Lackenbauer. The North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network, NADCEN, conducts leading-edge research with students, emerging scholars, and Northern stakeholders, rights holders, in relation to core Arctic defense and security policy challenges. NADCEN postgraduate fellow, Jill Barclay, is the webinar series rapporteur. Dr. Shannon Nash, the network manager, and Dr. Whitney Lackenbauer, the network lead, have been instrumental in the organization of this webinar series. And on behalf of the other two co-sponsors, I want to extend our gratitude and appreciation. The second co-sponsor, the Canadian Pugwash Group, of which I am vice chair, is the national affiliate of the Nobel Prize-winning Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs of Russell Einstein Manifesto fame. Fostering informed discussion and generating policy proposals on global security, including nuclear and conventional arms control, control of the arms trade, and environmental security, is the mandate of the Canadian Pugwash Group through organizing and supporting events such as this series. The third co-sponsor, the Rideau Institute, of which I am president, is an independent think tank with a mandate to help revitalize Canada's peacekeeping, diplomatic peacemaking, and peace-building roles in the world through inclusive multilateralism, strengthening the UN capacity for conflict prevention and peaceful conflict resolution, and the progressive enhancement of international law. Please note that the proceedings are being recorded for future public availability. And I note that the past sessions, the first two, the keynote and the first panel, are posted on the NADCEN website. And I think Shannon might put the link in the chat part for those here today. And with the help of our rapporteur, it is our intention to publish the proceedings to serve as an education tool to promote debate and to provide policy recommendations to government. I turn now to our moderator and NADCEN lead, Dr. Whitney Lackenbauer, Canada Research Chair in the Study of the Canadian North and a professor in the School for the Study of Canada at Trent University. Over to you, Whitney.
Well, thanks, Peggy, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to those of you who are new to the series. Greetings again to those of you who are returning. First of all, I want to acknowledge the Indigenous territories, Métis, First Nations, and Inuit, upon which we sit as we gather in this virtual context from all across Canada. In my case, I live in Oxford County on traditional Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee territory that's covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. By taking the time to acknowledge the land that I stand on, I remind myself of the long history of silencing in this country and the need to speak the truth in a journey towards reconciliation. Today, I am most delighted to introduce our two distinguished speakers to lead our discussion on a changing Arctic northern perspectives. They are truly community leaders with an astounding breadth and depth of experience and service to their communities and to our country. Bridget Larocque is an Indigenous resident of the Northwest Territories with extensive knowledge of the territory and regional and broader global worldviews, lots of experience on research methods, Indigenous and gender issues, amongst many, many other things. She serves as a policy advisor and researcher with the Arctic Athabascan Council and was executive director of Witchin Council International from 2007 to 2012. So she brings tremendous expertise on Arctic Council and Arctic governance issues to this discussion. Her other recent work includes the manager of self-government negotiations for the Gwich'in Tribal Council, land claim implementation coordinator, and project analyst with Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, an assistant negotiator with the Executive and Indigenous Affairs of the Government of the NWT, and executive director of the Fort Norman Métis community in Toledo, Northwest Territories, and I could go on and on. She is also strongly committed to mentoring young leaders in the North, as well as mentoring old academics from Southern Canada like myself. I'm also very honored to introduce Sergeant John Mitchell. I first met Mitch at Cape Isaacson on Ellefrignus Island in the high Arctic back in 2002, when he was completing the exercise Kiglakakvik Ranger to the magnetic North Pole. He had already been leading the Dawson Canadian Ranger Patrol for more than a decade. 19 years later, he's still at it. He has been leading efforts to break trail for the Yukon Quest for many years, many decades, has headed up his Community Search and Rescue Association for just as long. He is the most decorated Canadian Ranger in the country. Amongst his many honors are a Medal of Bravery for saving a young boy from being mauled to death by 2 Rottweilers, recipient of the Order of Military Merit, the Yukon Commissioner's Award for Bravery, and the Yukon Community Safety Award. And like Bridget, also very committed to mentoring young leaders through the Junior Canadian Ranger Program, First Hunt in partnership with the Trondheim and so on. So Bridget and Mitch, as always, I look very forward to hearing your thoughts. And Bridget, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Whitney. So my presentation today will be on Arctic security. Indigenous Voices Matter. Next slide, please. Just give me 1 second. I'm trying to remove. Shannon, can you tell me, I'm seeing Whitney, I'm not seeing the presentation, view options.
We're seeing it.
Okay.
Did that do it, Bridget?
Yeah, just give me 1 sec. I need
Yeah, for
to,
sure.
Okay, there. So I'll go through some thinking on Arctic security, and then some of the forms that we're engaged in, what treaty means for us, and then just some other advanced thinking. So Arctic security is complex to say the least for the average Indigenous person. The Arctic is our home. It not only sustains us, but keeps us resilient and healthy when it is itself kept in a healthy state. A place of peace and quiet. It is not like the hustle and bustle of outside the South and its big cities, all concrete and glass buildings, super malls, and paved roads. Our home is the boreal forest, tundra, and snow and ice. To the state, security is about power, hard power, and yet in Indigenous worldviews, security is about soft power, cooperation, peace, and responsibility. As Indigenous peoples, our worldview is about holism. Everything is interconnected. Taking up responsibility is commitment to protection of our environment. We are responsible for human health, environmental protection, and water quality. Another word for this responsibility is collective stewardship, based on Indigenous values and worldview. From a soft power way of thinking, we need to talk about social well-being, co-management regimes, and governance. How will military security fit into this conversation? And what is our role if ever under military threat or global threat, which we now are with respect to climate change? Next slide, please. Mark Lantain indicated in his September 18, 2020 paper, whose Arctic security is it anyway? The problem, however, is whether this talk, militarization of the Arctic, will result in more obscurity around many other pressing areas of Arctic security, especially those on the individual level and related to so-called non-traditional security concerns such as development, education, the environment, gender and health, including the effects of COVID-19, which is also affecting the region in the here and now. Next slide. I'll ask the same question about militarization of the Arctic. What do we as Indigenous people do about the non-traditional security concerns such as development, education, the environment, gender and health, including the effects of COVID-19? How does Indigenous self-determination, rights, land, community, spirituality, and decolonization get addressed? Freedom from the destructive regimes we find ourselves, colonization and patriarchal controls, replaced our matriarchal system and overlooked women's rights to lands, governance, and disregarded our power and worldview. If we accept that militarization is the process by which a society organizes itself for military conflict and violence, then how does the state protect us from conflict and violence? Or why are they putting us, residents in the Arctic, in harm's way? The most significant agreements that Indigenous peoples have with Canada on security and sovereignty are their historical treaties, and since 1973, modern day treaties. From the written word of Jean-Pierre Morin, historian, the Treaty Policy Directorate of the Indigenous Northern Affairs Canada, CERNAC now, the treaties negotiated and concluded between the Crown and many of Canada's First Nations, now Métis and Inuit, are foundational documents in the history of Canada. These treaties established peaceful relations during times of colonial war, established a prosperous economic and commercial trade, and allowed for the organized expansion of Canada. Without these treaties, Canada would likely not be as we know it today. Historic treaties are not only solemn documents binding the parties to ongoing obligations, they are also documents enshrined in and protected by our Constitution. As the treaties will last as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow, they will continue to be a central element of the relationship between Canada and First Nations peoples, Métis and Inuit. This means Indigenous peoples are not to be harassed on their lands. How can Canada guarantee this if external military conflict happens? And how can we as Indigenous peoples avoid militarization? Next slide. Besides treaties, and there's other such forums that address Northern issues and has NGO and stakeholders as members, but where are the Indigenous voices? The Arctic Security Group is a forum for information exchange with the aim to enhance the security and the exercise of sovereignty of Canada's North through information sharing and cooperation among federal, territorial government departments and agencies, as well as non-governmental organizations, academics, the private sector, and other stakeholders with an interest in Northern issues. The issue of Arctic sovereignty and security is of significant importance to the Northwest Territories. The GNWT participates in the Arctic Security Working Group, which provides a biannual forum where representatives share information on sovereignty and security matters. Is there consultation or adequate resources provided for meaningful participation? Where are the gender voices? Canada's Arctic and Northern Policy Framework states Canada's sovereignty over the Arctic region is long-standing, well-established and based on historic title and founded in part on the presence of Inuit First Nations since time immemorial. The Métis are not mentioned here, although recognized as an Aboriginal people in the Canadian Constitution. Canada's Arctic and Northern governments and communities are at the heart of security in the region. Partnership, cooperation, and shared leadership are essential to promoting security in this diverse, complex, and expansive area. Working partnership with trusted international allies and all levels of government, including Indigenous communities, organizations and governments, Canada will continue to protect the safety and security of the people in the Arctic and the North, now and into the future. As stated in June 2019 report of the Special Committee on the Arctic called Northern Lights, a wake-up call for the future of Canada, government policies must align with the various priorities of Northerners, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, empowering Northerners to create their own programs and initiatives. The ultimate goal in our community's views should be the eventual devolution of decision-making powers about Northern issues to Northern institutions. Decisions about the North must be made in the North, for the North, and by the North. Again, from the Senate report, Arctic residents keenly observed other countries' interest in the region's natural resources and the Northwest Passage. The committee recommends that the Government of Canada ensure the Canadian Arctic security and safety and assert and protect Canada's sovereignty in the Arctic. In the committee's view, actions ensuring prosperous, sustainable, and safe Arctic communities are vital to enhance Canada's ability to project its Arctic foreign policy, including sovereignty in the region. Human security was popularized in the 1994 United Nations Human Development Report, expanding the notion of security include dimensions of food, health, community, environmental, economic, personal, political security, with the intention to, in part, address some of the glaring weaknesses of security theory and practice. The strongest argument for protecting the environment is the ethical need to guarantee to future generations opportunities similar to the ones previous generations have enjoyed. This guarantee is the foundation of sustainable development. Yet, we know that the UN's Sustainable Development Goals are not being implemented in funding priorities or state budgets. How can we talk about Arctic security when we don't know what we are asked to do if ever under military threat? As Indigenous peoples, our worldview is about holism, and everything's connected, as indicated earlier. All my relations means that everything, animate, inanimate, animals, our environment, water, land, must be considered as varying worldviews have to be reconciled when it comes to military security. Policies developed without the knowledge and wisdom of Indigenous expertise, lifelong Northerners, is nothing more than the continuation of the colonial methodology that perpetuates antagonism. There are conversations held without Indigenous meaningful participation. So what does protection through hard power, military security, and soft power, SDWG, ASWG, AC, and UN look like for Arctic Indigenous peoples? Participation of Indigenous peoples as experts and real partners in Canada's security organizations must be genuine. Tokenism is ineffective and unacceptable. In the book, Braden Legal Orders Implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, states that implementation is key to giving effect to UNDRIP and moving past the current colonial relationship. To implement UNDRIP, Canadian constitutional law must shift in its approach to defining Indigenous peoples' rights toward ensuring that the rights are defined according to Indigenous peoples' legal traditions, ensuring that the rights protected under Section 35 align with UNDRIP, while will mean that Indigenous peoples' rights will continue to be recognized in the highest law of the land. The Arctic Council Advisory Committee is a forum for engagement of federal, territorial, provincial, Indigenous partners on the development and implementation of Canada's international Arctic policy, including Arctic Council related matters. The committee also serves as the main governance mechanism for overseeing implementation of the international dimension of the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework. 4 objectives: ensure regular dialogue between federal, territorial, provincial governments and Canadian permanent participant organizations. with a view to identifying areas of common interest and mutually supportive action. Engage territorial, provincial, PRM participant partners on the development and implementation of Canada's international Arctic policy, including positions taken at the Arctic Council and other international forums. Promote greater awareness of Arctic Council and other relevant international activities among committee members and their respective institutions. Fourth, review progress in implementing the international dimension of the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework. In considering all this, several years past, there was a Pan-Territorial Arctic Forum, and one of the recommendations I have is that we rejuvenate the Pan-Territorial Forum with the inclusion of PRM participants. Some issues that this forum may address are Arctic human health research, policy making on Arctic foreign policy, UNDRIP implementation, Indigenous sovereignty, Arctic defense and security. However, the dilemma is, how will Indigenous premiers advance Indigenous rights and self-determination while representatives of non-Indigenous constituents and as sub-national governments with the Canadian Federation? And that's the end of my presentation. Welcome any comments or questions later, and on to the next speaker.
Thanks, Bridget. Mitch, over to you.
Okay, I'm here. Hi, everybody from Dawson City. As you probably gathered by now, I'm Mitch. And first, thanks of all for inviting me to participate in this event. It's been pretty interesting to date. Firstly, as I always do, I want to put a disclaimer out and make sure everybody understands that what I present today is a personal perspective based on about 45 years of my life in the Yukon. And it's been a pretty diverse, interesting, and rewarding one. Whitney touched on some of the stuffs I've done. I started out in the land, living on the land, trapping, commercial fishing, barge pilot, gold mine manager, gold construction superintendent, and now I'm theoretically semi-retired in these fields, and that's not working worth a damn. So during my life, also up here, it's been important. I've worked and lived with the local First Nation, the Trondikwichen, in various capacities, running their housing program, developing good northern housing, and also in the outdoor programs with the youths, members, and the elders. As Whitney mentioned, I've also had 30 years of service as a Canadian Ranger Sergeant. And this is really special to me, as this position is an elected one, and it's the only democratic part of the Canadian Forces. So I'm probably the longest serving sergeant in the Rangers at this point. And in this position, what's been great is I've had ample opportunity to travel a lot in the north and work, make friends, and interact with fellow Rangers within the tree line and all across the high Arctic. Okay, and we'll leave that. I don't like talking about me. Headquarters, of course, is always, and especially at this juncture in command, very sensitive to the personal views of Rangers. We're directed to speak only about what we know. After 30 years of service as a Ranger Sergeant, I find this kind of humorous coming from people that, for the most part, have a max of 4 years of time in with the Rangers. So just to be clear, I want to say today, what I say today doesn't reflect the views of the Canadian Forces and the Ranger Command. That being said, my chances of making Chief of Defense Staff or getting a promotion are substantially less of those of the proverbial snowball and hill. So the Rangers also naturally led me, as Whitney mentioned in the start, and I put in over 25 years of my career getting Granny and other people off of the proverbial mountain. So thanks, Whitney, for this opportunity. We've already heard some presentations capturing the geopolitics, global, national, and regional views in this webinar. I'm going to drop things down a little bit more to the local level to where us northerners live in the tundra, on the rivers and the lakes and the sea ice. So let's talk about Mitch's current views on the changing Arctic, or at least it's changing subarctic where I live. So we're going to talk a little bit about climate change and global warming, a little bit about social changes, about changes in the mining and industry up here, a little bit about COVID, and of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention sovereignty and the Rangers. And these, of course, are only some of the factors at work today, and they gotta be viewed as a combined impact or effect on our north. So the first one everybody talks about, of course, is climate change and global warming, specifically temperatures. We've all heard the Arctic is heating up, the ice caps are melting. And yeah, they are, but after living through the last week with temperatures dropping to -15 C at night, I think we can safely say we're not ready to break out the bikinis or grow bananas in the Yukon yet. That being said, my take is on it this from my time on the land. Yeah, we're seeing a gradual warming trend over the last 45 years here at the local level. We still have cold weather, but it's not as cold and not as long in duration as we had when I first came into the country. And just FYI, my coldest experience then while out on the trail was -78 Fahrenheit. And to summarize that experience, as Sam McGee said, it wasn't much fun at all. More important than the actual temperatures are the changes in the local weather patterns and their effect on the land, the wildlife, and on the people who live on the land. Recently, the warmer fall temperatures have generally shifted river freeze-ups to a bit later in dates, and the somewhat warmer temperatures seem to result in thinner ice and more open water on the waterways. This has presented new challenges in the construction of the ice bridges that provide the winter road access into certain areas during the winter, and even for travel on the waterways with the light snow machines used by the trappers and hunters. It's just getting harder to get around. On the land, I would say also that the warmer temperatures have changed the behavior of the animals we harvest for food, and in particular, the mainstay of caribou and moose. The migration of caribou herds have changed. They are tending not to cross into the Yukon or staying farther north in Alaska. And this makes them less accessible to the communities as a reliable food source. And I think that part of that has to do with the status of the rivers that they need to cross during the migrations. They get there and they don't have thin enough water to swim in and thick enough ice to go on. This is a lean land up here. It doesn't support large number of animals for long periods of time, and caribou must move to live. They seldom stay in one place for very long. So if they can't make it here, they'll go elsewhere. With moose, it seems that the fall ruts when we harvest their meat, which is key off the temperature, are much later, much more drawn out, and seem to be more locally specific and erratic. Before, we used to say, hey, first frost in September, it's time to go get some moose meat. Now it's spread out all over the place in no discernible manner. They seem to come into rut at different times and different locations. And this, of course, also means that the annual harvests have decreased. We've also seen different new species of animals slowly and erratically moving north. Deer, coyote, and even cougars, for example. There seems to be more human and wildlife interactions and conflicts reported lately. Part of this, of course, comes as urban expansion. Yes, the population of the Yukon is growing. It's doubled since I came here way back in '76 to now 42,000. And it pushes farther out into new areas, and new resource roads are being constructed that allow access into these areas. But also some species are behaving differently. Surprisingly, this year, for example, we've had 2 recorded instances of lynx, which are normally a pretty shy animal, attacking dogs in the presence of humans. That's not right. And of course, even here in our Klondike locale, there's evidence the permafrost melts, slides, new drainage patterns, etc. So that's some of the things we're seeing coming off of the gradual warming here. Social change, there's also been some significant social and political changes. And most significant, in my opinion, in this period that I've lived through, it's been the time of land claims and self-government for the First Nations and Native people. In simplicity to me, I totally agree with this, but there are teething problems with this, and I'll leave that for another discussion at another time. But you know, it's been a real change that way. In the mining industry is the other big change we're seeing. Mining, specifically placer mining, is the reason for the existence of the Yukon. The discovery of gold in 1896 and the ensuing gold rush, the Klondike Gold Rush in 1898, changed the Yukon forever as over 30,000 gold seekers flooded into the territory. This had a dramatic impact on the land and is well recognized on the First Nation people. As one First Nation elder told me, the trouble is you stayed. Mining continues to be an important factor in shaping the territory as we know it today. Recently, however, the emphasis has shifted from the bread and butter placer mining to hard rock exploration and production. And this is creating a whole new dynamic within the territory. While the large hard rock mines are creating employment, financial opportunities, and also access into remote areas, they are also creating conflicts within the First Nation, territorial government, federal governments, and of course the conservation-minded groups. Access, more than the actual mining, has a greater impact on the land, and we must remember that. And while their existence creates employment, the importing of out-of-territory workers to fill positions in the mines places a huge strain on the housing and the social networks within the territory. This is a complicated and challenging tightrope for the Yukon to walk today. Other new to the territory, of course, is COVID, and we live with that every day. It's definitely affected life and business in the Yukon as we know it. And although we've weathered the initial pandemic storm and have 0 active cases, the situation is still affecting our lives and will continue to do so at least for the next year. It'll be interesting to see what the coming summer brings us with the influx of visitors and workers from outside. That's a real question mark there. Okay, the Canadian Rangers, the North, and sovereignty. And this is where I potentially get into trouble. So Whitney, cut me off if I get too far off course, okay? Remember, this is a personal opinion only. I won't dwell on the origins of the Rangers. I think most in this webinar are aware of them and have at least a partial background. If you're really interested, I'd recommend you read one of Whitney's literary creations. He mostly got it right. Okay. There's some people that have observed that there's been a loss of traditional lifestyles and the associated skills with the Arctic people. In the Rangers, it's not quite that simple. Just as the Yukon has changed over the past 45 years, so have the Rangers. And today, a lot of these traditional skills are being integrated into our current operations. And I believe the melding of the traditional skills with modern equipment has in general increased our capability on the land. And so, yeah, we don't have as many dog mushers within the ranks now, but then we really don't use dogs much anymore either. Our equipment has been slowly upgraded, and I do mean slowly. The process of acquisition of military equipment from the point of view of us who have feet on the Arctic ground rangers sometimes defies common sense and lacks proper appreciation for a thing called timeliness. And in the North, this is certainly not limited to the Rangers. Has anybody seen one of our Arctic patrol vessels lately? Sovereignty does not lose its importance due to the changes that are happening. If anything, to me, it becomes even more important. So the bottom line for the Rangers now is that in the absence of all these technological advances that we don't have, we should be utilizing the Ranger more. We know they work. We need to learn more about the changes occurring in the Arctic and adapt our operations to suit them and continue to maintain Canada's sovereignty presence. And that's it, short and simple.
Thank you, Mitch. Thank you, Bridget, both for wonderful commentaries and also for launching us into a series of, I think questions that are already flowing through the chat, which some of you might be following along with. First question, Bridget, and Mitch, I'll invite you to comment on it as well, and that you've presented on several occasions to the Arctic Security Working Group. A bit more reflection on it, if you don't mind, Bridget. I'll just kind of say in answer to Adele's comment. So the Arctic Security Working Group was first created in the late 1990s, officially had its first meeting in November of 1999, has met since that time, and really was initially a forum to bring together particularly government stakeholders, and then in the early days, Indigenous government representatives as well, to talk about Arctic security very broadly defined. So this is before the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment had been released, before climate change was that inconvenient truth that had been sort of unveiled for the world in the Arctic. It was very much a body of just anticipating what challenges might come. So looking at issues of sovereignty, looking at the role of defense, and over time, also looking at the role of all the other government departments and agencies, not only at the federal level, but also particularly at the territorial levels. So as Bridget alluded to, there's not been a lot of engagement by Indigenous governments. Government of Nunavut as a public government is always well represented at each of the meetings. So it means that there are Indigenous peoples always at the table. But in terms of representation of Indigenous governments themselves, that's one of those things that's not a very major fixture of it. But it's very much then modeled on a distinct practitioner-focused, operator-level focus, conversation forum to build relationships and share ideas about how Canada can approach security. So Bridget, I don't know if you want to reflect more on some of those comments. I just thought maybe I'd introduce that as somebody who's been on the Arctic Security Working Group for the better part of a decade now, that it's something between the government of Canada, federal government, and territorial government. But I know you have some pretty, I think some very interesting ideas about how the Arctic Security Working Group or something playing a function similar to it can be opened up or facilitate more of that dialogue with other groups of Northerners.
Yes, Whitney, for sure. My observations and my lived experience here in the NWT is that, there's various different groups and think tanks that get established and put together and meaningfully and welcomingly to a certain extent. However, if the Indigenous voice isn't there, if the gendered voice isn't there, then once again, we're dealing with, high-level patriarchal systems and colonized to a certain extent if we're going to be ignoring the voices that matter, the people that will be most impacted by decision makers or policy thinkers from the South. And no offense to you, Whitney, as an academic, but we'd like these partnerships with academia to advance the Indigenous perspective and Indigenous issues. If we don't have academics as our allies and partners, then who do we have? Because the government, unfortunately, is set up to look after all citizens and not just necessarily the ones they have established historic treaties with, and now also these new modern day treaties. But there has to be engagement and meaningful engagement where, you know, all voices that are going to be impacted are heard and respected.
Great, thanks, Bridget. Mitch, I wondered if you had any reflections on ASWIG having been there and some of what it does.
Yeah, I really agree with a bunch of the points that Bridget put out there. I guess if we can skip through all the talking and get to the bottom of it, I'd like to see these great ideas come together into a plan that is implemented. So we're moving forward and just not talking about the same things in a different way forever and ever. Amen. And that doesn't have to be, I think we get stuck sometimes on, you know, the all-encompassing serve everything plan, when sometimes, hey, maybe we take a look at a short-term thing so we get the ball proverbially rolling sort of deal. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, it's interesting too. One of the observations I've had of the Arctic Security Working Group is it's very positive in terms of forging relationships between the different stakeholders who at the operator level or at the practitioner level need to figure out how to get things done when the policy has huge gaps in it, or when strategies are either not implemented at all or only partially implemented and there's a real patchwork. What I find is interesting is for the people who do participate, and Bridget, you've identified some gaps in terms of representativeness, but the benefits of having people who are actually dealing with these issues on the ground in a practical way, of having mechanisms or forums to be able to get things done or figure out how you can get things done. You can't just retreat behind the, oh, well, we don't have clarity in terms of whose mandate this would fall under or who's going to direct it. You know, Mitch, as you love to say, when it's time to get Granny off the mountain, you figure out a way to get it done. And I think that spirit, you know, is what the Arctic Security Working Group is trying to accomplish. And I think, Bridget, you also raised that there's also a gap in terms of the public face of some of these institutions and fora, in that the Arctic Security Working Group has not generally reached out to diverse audiences to explain what it's doing or to share some of those conversations going on within. That leads into a question that Paul Meyer has posed about references in the discussion to the several institutions that are out there dedicated to Arctic matters on various levels, right? We've got the Arctic Security Working Group that we just talked about, the Arctic Council Advisory Committee. Bridget, I know you've been involved in that for a long time. You referenced the Pan-Territorial Forum, which is not active. Do you feel that these institutions are effective in their tasks? Is it that these, either, we talked about this in the ASWIG, but for the other ones, is it that they're too limited in what they're being asked to do? Or is that we need to complement those with additional or new mechanisms or forums to have these conversations? Bridget, I hope you can make something out of that rather tortured question by me. And sorry, Paul, if I didn't.
Well, we also, we also talk about not working in silos, Whitney, and I think we still do that too often, not only with respect to impacts in the North or in the Arctic, but also in the provincial North. And of course, we know one size doesn't fit all, but how can we feed off of, learn from, consider a good practice, consider a best practice when we don't know necessarily what other established organizations are doing? And, you know, if we talk about climate change being a global issue, global impact, and global impacts impact all of us. It's not an Indigenous issue. It's not a circumpolar issue. It's a global issue. So how do we collaborate and corroborate all the good science and all the good thinking to, you know, come up with, you know, solutions or suggestions, and or even tweak what's out there that has proven to be beneficial in certain areas. So, you know, like I said earlier, the Pan-Territorial Forum that was set up originally for the 3 territorial premiers to meet with the 3 Canadian perm participants of the Arctic Council. That has fallen by the wayside. However, even if you have that dialogue, then how do these 3 premiers, who may or may not be Indigenous, give significant or concentrate significantly on Indigenous issues if they are, and that's their dilemma, they're there to represent all citizens of their territory. You mentioned Nunavut is more of a public government structure. Yukon has a different relationship with Canada. And then, of course, the NWT territorial government has a different relationship with Canada. And the NWT is 50-50 non-Indigenous and Indigenous. So, you know, there's complexities across all 3 territories, but that doesn't mean to say that there shouldn't be some dialogue and that there shouldn't be some more deep level conversations to talk about the best ways forward on Arctic issues, northern issues, and then because we rely heavily on the premiers to have conversations at the premier level ship, and then also with Canada.
Thanks, Bridget. Mitch, I wonder, you've been involved in many different forums and roundtables and organizations over the years. And thinking of the different hats that you wear and have worn, wonder, are there any particular roundtables or activities that you've been involved in the past that could or should be resurrected or rejuvenated in your view to accomplish some of these effects that you and Bridget are talking about?
Yeah, I'm more of a feet on the ground on that, Whitney. I think the whole one, and you and I have talked about it, that is of concern with me is with the expanding or the, you know, things getting busy in the north, is the whole search and rescue and safety net. And I don't want to limit that to Joe lost in the bush under a spruce tree or an ice chunk. The safety net looks at the safety net from the whole community in terms of that, okay? It's a bigger picture than just search and rescue, for example. And I think that's something that we should talk about, because we made advances in that, and I'm sure there's some role models out there that we could learn from, you know.
Well, thanks, Mitch. And I see that Dr. Peter Kickert has asked a question, and he organized a very successful Kitikmeot roundtable on search and rescue last year around this time, just before COVID set in, that I think maybe played with a lot of those issues, as you said, not just search and rescue in the individual search response, but also broader dealing with disaster management and this broader safety net. I love that phrase. Pete has also posed a question. Sergeant Mitchell, could you comment on the Ranger role in response to COVID-19 and some of the impacts that the pandemic has had on Ranger training and operations? And after that, Bridget, I'd love your further reflections as well on COVID-19, which you've seen not only in Yellowknife, but also within the territories, and perhaps some lessons you might suggest or things that you've observed.
Okay, I can address the question from Peter there. In terms of the Rangers, what happened was that the Canadian Forces stood up and started operating under Operation Laser, which was in response to the pandemic. As part of that, the Rangers, to shortcut all the communications and talking, were stood up to various capacities all the way across the north. Their roles varied. From one of observation and communication only, saying, hey, we're all good, or we've got this many cases, or this is happening, to some organizing hunting parties to go out to community to hunt for the food on the land and bring home the meat sort of deal. We also, in that, in Dawson at least, of course, it never rains but it pours. So concurrent to the COVID, just as it was peaking out, we had a flood emergency, and we ended up going on standby and actually doing a water rescue where we saved 2 young guys from the river. And that was really rewarding. I mean, the response, because we were already up on standby, was like in a half an hour. We had boats going and we pulled these 2 young dummies off the middle of the river. They come down in the high water on a canoe and they ended up stranded in the middle of the river. And we were able to get that off. So that was great that way. After that, it tapered off down to mainly observations and reporting to the headquarters on what was going on in the communities. So.
Thanks, Mitch. Bridget, I wondered if you had any thoughts on COVID-19 you'd like to share with the group.
Yeah, just briefly, when COVID-19 came about, we a lot of Indigenous communities shut down their own respective borders, as small as they were, not only in the provincial north, but also in the 3 territories. And, there was initially this huge anxiety and concern. And, the community started thinking about ways that they can keep their communities and the families safe. So a lot of them went out on the land, removing themselves from the community, knowing that in March, of course, was spring break, teachers were coming back, families were coming back from the south, and there was that uncertainty. Then they're also, the NWT territorial government for sure put us in kind of a lockdown, restrictions on travel. People coming in were to be essential workers only. The territory was shut down. People were having to work from home. And there's, of course, always positives and negatives, because then the children are home impacting their parents during the workday. And then you would see the anxiety, because then all of a sudden the stores were being, products were in low supply. There was, concerns of hoarding. We had issues of Yellowknife being the center of burden, more or less, because communities that are able to get in and fly in were coming here, and then accessing all the amenities and resources here. So there's a lot of these impacts. The one big thing, however, though, was scientifically at the Arctic Council level, the ministers of the Arctic Council of the 8 nation states asked the Sustainable Development Working Group through the Arctic Human Health Experts Group and the Socioeconomic Committee to look at impacts of COVID and to really look at what's happening where. So there was a paper put together for the ministers, both from an academic and grassroots perspective, and what we were seeing on the ground, and also what was being researched scientifically. So there was I think a huge collaboration on really trying to get a clear picture of what was happening on the ground, but also what was happening scientifically. And, I think in certain states and certain areas, we have fared a lot better than other larger centers. And I think we could have done a lot better as human beings, not necessarily just being told by the governments in our respective territories and countries, but just from ourselves is how do we look to our health and consider what's important from a more humanistic approach and perspective than being the questioning science to the extent where then it became kind of like conspiracy theories, which, you know, does nothing but, you know, increase anxiety, I think, in a lot of the areas.
Thanks, Bridget. Switching gears, we got a few more questions here queuing up. I'll try to put two of them together here for your reflections. Relating to the theme, sort of now taking things way up to the great power competition, so some of the geopolitical or geostrategic dynamics, how much is the resurgence of great power competition in the Arctic a narrative that you're hearing about at the community level or at the regional level in the North? So Ernie Regier has asked a question, is this competition of visceral presence? Does it affect how communities relate with their counterparts? And I think he's particularly thinking about in other Arctic states or the way we perceive of others. Are there any implications that you're seeing at the community level of all of this talk about great power competition and the danger of militarization in the Arctic spilling over or affecting Canada's ability to do things in the North? And if you don't like that question, the other one could be relating to perceptions of some of those major powers, non-like-minded states like Russia and China, who don't have necessarily the same concept of respect for sovereignty, never mind indigenous sovereignty, Bridget, like you're referring to, and Mitch, that you referred to. So I guess your thoughts on what you're hearing at the community level about great power competition or assumptions about Canada's place in a world that seems to be a lot more uncertain and potentially more volatile than we perhaps were imagining it to be even 5 years ago.
Okay. Wow. So, you know, Whitney, it's hard for Indigenous peoples to think of sovereignty, and especially sovereignty with Canada, because we come from different perspectives on what sovereignty means, which you alluded to anyway. But, you know, a lot of Indigenous peoples will defend Canada, not necessarily because it's Canada, but this is because it's our homeland. When we hear about these superpowers, if we want to call them that, China and Russia, of course, we have concerns with nuclear armaments and so forth, sort of things that are beyond our control. What could we possibly do if they don't even respect humanity to any kind of extent in their own lives? Then how can we possibly, as a smaller group of people, have any real political clout in those areas? The other thing, I think we rely heavily on Canada as a peacekeeper. Hopefully, although it's diminished its a merit on that, hopefully there's some ways through United Nations and other fora to rebuild this thinking. But I think there has to be a bigger platform where all the states come together and figure out how cooperation and sharing of resources that doesn't deplete the earth can possibly work together. I think in a small territory like the Northwest Territories, we sit back and sometimes those are too big issues for us to even consider when we're just struggling on a day-to-day basis to survive and try to keep ourselves sustained with the, with the resources that we have. Sometimes we can't even think about Russia and China when we're worried about the impact of our own development, Tarzans, pipelines, impacting our livelihood, impacting our animals, the birds, our water, our land, logging, taking away our trees. And these things are also spiritually significant to us. And water is all of our lifeline. Without water, we're all nothing. So, this isn't only an Indigenous issue. It's a global issue. It's a human issue. So that's all I have to offer on those global perspectives.
Thanks, Mitch.
Yeah, Bridget said it pretty well on the whole thing there. There doesn't seem to be a lot of interest or appreciation for the bigger issues, Whitney. And again, I'll reiterate or echo what Bridget said. The interest, talking from the ranger point of view, with my rangers, that 60% of them are First Nations people. Yeah, and I think that's the link or the tie into this whole sovereignty, not saying how you spell it and that it means different things, but it's the tie into the territorial lands that they really get into is being able to go out and travel, patrol the lands and keep an eye on them. And that's really important to them. And bear in mind, we're sitting out here at, 2,500 miles from Ottawa. That's a long ways to the nation's capital. And for me anyway, and whether people and put it in so many words on that, it does, as rangers, being on patrol in our traditional territory, make us feel a little bit more Canadian.
Thanks. Again, not to shift gear, grind the gears too much here, but we are a little bit over time. I hope everybody will at least be able to make available, if you can, time for maybe about 10 more minutes of discussion. So I'm gonna have to compress some of the questions together, and I hope I do them justice, but please, Bridget, Mitch, feel free to go through the chat and see if you like the language written in there more than the questions I'm posing. Building off of this, we've, talking about issues or touching on issues of infrastructure and food security, to be jargony, supply chains. A lot of this stuff obviously brought to the fore in light of COVID recently, but also obviously affected by climate change and other these larger drivers. And I bring this up because when I was in Kugluktuk last February, I'd asked a similar question about great power competition and asked the group of rangers, what do you think about Russia and China? And there was about 2 minutes of just silence. Everybody was thinking through. And then one of the young rangers kind of said, well, we don't. We're worried about, Mitch, a lot of the things that you referenced, which is, where are the caribou at this time of year? Are they going to come close this time? What's going on in terms of being able to travel safely over the land, and so on. And if I was a good listener, what I think that they were telling me was, those are conversations we're happy to leave for other people to deal with. In essence, we want to see action and we want to be involved in the conversations that matter to us on the ground. So maybe a weird connection, but I'd love to hear from both of you. If the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff came up to you today and said, I will action whatever you give to me as your priority investment to improve the North, to improve quality of life at the community level, or if you want to improve human security or environmental security, I'd love to hear from both of you. What would that be? And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but we have questions, about naval vessels versus Coast Guard vessels, port facilities, transitions from diesel electric dependency towards green technologies for energy generation. If you were given a moment to help to set the priorities, what would your priority be? Bridget, if you don't mind, I'll put you on the spot first.
Conversation. How can we even think about how we may interact with China or Russia if we may not necessarily know who they are? So, and then are we going to believe and trust in what Canada is saying to us when they have not had that dialogue with us in the past? The other thing, Whitney, is the treatment and disregard for Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous peoples placed in Canada. So where does that leave us with really wanting to engage our share with Canada, with the government of Canada? So and then, we grew up playing this game, I declare war on whoever, and we didn't know what war was. So, how do we think we can impact other people's lives without even knowing if they're a threat or a support or who they are? So, I think at a lot of times, where Canada, we weren't even human beings until they determined policy or put in an act that recognized us. So the trust on what they're doing geopolitically, what Canada is and is not doing at Arctic security or at the UN or through NATO, the relationships of Canada and the United States, and the United States and Mexico, in North America, what kind of relationship does that mean? Where then the states more or less as a superpower ignoring Canada, or taking as much away from Canada on its resources as it possibly can, and then impacts on Mexico. So all these geopolitical international concerns, yes, a lot of us can say, no, we're concentrating on the ground on what's happening to now in our lives, but how do we try to expand our own borders to even have an international impact? And that's huge, because even at the Arctic Council, we're there at the table as participants, entering into dialogue interventions. However, we don't have a vote. So once again, there again, internationally, we're still not on equal footing with our nation states.
Mitch, I wonder if you have any reflections you'd like to add on that, or the other question, sorry, I kind of compressed the two, was about where you might see strategic investments, whether it's infrastructure or if Canada was at an opportunity where it said, okay, we've got this Arctic Northern Policy Framework, which has so many different priorities in it and no clear hierarchy of priorities, that it's not something that's implementable, if that's even a word. What might you suggest, or even if you want, from a Dawson standpoint, what kind of government investment do you think would have the greatest impact on members of your community or citizens in your?
Okay, if I was specifically to go on again, I'm going to stay within my AO, Sydney, my area of operations, and theoretically a little expertise there. In terms of the rangers, get them out on the land. Okay, we're burning daylight and we're wasting time and we're not putting enough money, and it's not an expensive proposition compared to building Nunavut, or sorry, Nanisivik up, or probably doesn't even cover two props on one of those patrol vessels, but we need to maintain a Canadian presence out there. In terms of the communities, again, it's the sustainability, the safety net within the communities. We got to start looking what we got when things go wrong and get it there. At the very least, do some serious planning and implementation. Because, really, in some of the communities, Lord help us if the power goes out. Things are going to get rather chilly, sort of deal. And I'll leave the other stuff to somebody that knows more about it than I do.
No, thanks. It's a great answer. Bridget, I wondered if you had any sort of top of mind thoughts about that in terms of sort of the big investments. And big investments, as I think Mitch just gave a great example of, doesn't necessarily mean national in scope or huge money. Big investments can be turning to communities and investing in sustainable communities and bolstering resilience at a community level as a first priority.
So we shifted from this huge geopolitical impact. So just wondered about infrastructure in the Arctic then. Yeah, I think there has to be a huge overview of what it is the territories want to be, how they want to operate, and what is important to them. If it's the Indigenous peoples, then we're in 2021. We still talk about huge issues with education. Homelessness is popping up more and more. So we have all these social disparities, suicides. But you have to know why these things are occurring, and why they're happening, and some of the work out there that can combat that. The other thing is, when we're talking about education, then what kind of education? Because clearly in our schools, we are not teaching STEM to the extent that we should. Speaking earlier with a colleague of mine from Iceland, we were talking about education. Well, back in the day, anybody that wasn't considered university material were thrown in the trades. Well, if we're talking about infrastructure, that's the trades people that have to have these high level mathematical skills to know how to structure the infrastructure. And in technology, it's, once again, Whitney, you're cutting in and out a bit. We're asked to look at Zoom, and yet we're struggling with bandwidth and fiber optics. So there's so many different things to concentrate on, but we're not having those conversations at a high level in the territories. And then the territories are so heavily dependent on Canada. We talk in Canada about the have and have not provinces. Well, we're the have not territories. And, even though Nunavut is a public government, well, to a huge extent, where's our own source revenues? Where's the revenue from all of the mining industry, all of the mines that were operating in the Northwest Territories? So what is happening with the resources that are extracted or come from the territories? Where are those going, and why are we only getting such a small proportion of them for the operations of 100,000 people, but a huge vast territory and huge communities, or not huge communities, but 32, 33 communities, Northwest Territories, and so many of them in very isolated, remote settlements. So what's the impact really financially? And if we had a wish list, what would be the financial resources required to keep the territory sustainable? And instead of, constantly dependent on the federal government. So it's a huge issue, Whitney. I don't have the exact answer, but I think we have to have statistics, we have to have data, we have to know what we're up against, whether some of the real hardcore infrastructure needs, what are the education needs so we have our own human capacity, and we have capacity building that is going to be brought into the future for a more sustainable, prosperous territory.
Well, thanks, Bridget, for that. And what a fitting end. Thanks, Mitch, Bridget, for bringing your lived experience, your very deep knowledge, and dare I say wisdom on a lot of these issues to our conversation. I've certainly learned a lot. I think one of the themes has been education. And I always feel that whenever I have the great pleasure of speaking with either of you, and today with both of you, I learn a tremendous amount. And Bridget, I think you repeatedly brought up the issue of trust and the need for trust, and trust will only be earned if there's conversations that are meaningful, are substantive, and that don't shy away from the big issues or the core issues. And I thank both of you for really encouraging our group to grapple with some of those issues and to not get lost thinking about the great power competition and some of those global drivers, but to remember at the end of the day that what we care about is, as fellow Canadians, making sure that we're able to live sustainable, fulfilling lives. And again, I think you've given us a lot of food for thought in this, and continue to welcome your insights as we move forward. And thank you for also sharing your ideas about priorities, because I think that you both referenced the importance of, we can have grand plans, we can have general statements, but unless we can figure out ways of implementing and figuring out where to channel our resources, it often doesn't lead to fulfilling outcomes. So thanks for helping us to channel our energies in a fruitful way. Thanks to everybody for listening. Thanks for your questions. We didn't get through them all, but I think that's a very good sign. And we'll certainly store some of them as well for the last session, when you can, pepper Peggy and myself with some of them as well. So thanks everybody for participating. Peggy, over to you for last words.
Yes, well, now it's time for me to also thank our speakers and our moderator on behalf of everyone, and to thank you, our participants. I think it was a fantastic discussion. And to remind you that the next session, panel 3, A Changing Arctic Political and Legal Considerations, will take place on Thursday, this Thursday, 11 February, from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you again, and good day to you all.